you. Thank you very much for that incredibly kind reception. Can I first of all say that standing here and looking out at the sea of faces, if I'm allowed to say this, young faces, I think that the most important thing to say this evening is this is the right institute at the right time in the right place. It's the right institute because I think the study of political economy is more important now than it has ever been. Speaking to you tonight reminds me of the last time I spoke to an audience like this, a slightly smaller audience, when I was teaching at Harvard University in 2003. And I think what is remarkable, if you consider where we are now as compared to where we are at that time, is the way the world has massively changed with the global financial crisis. And the way in which huge assumptions which have been taken for granted, and this is the subject of my lecture tonight, huge assumptions which have been taken for granted for a very, very long time have been thrown up in the air. Thrown up in the air in this country, in the United States, indeed right across the developed world. And so the thing I would say most of all actually to the young people here tonight is I think this is an incredibly exciting time to be studying economics or politics, because the script for the future is a much more open question than it has been for a very, very long time in this country and elsewhere. That's why I think it's the right institute, and indeed at the right time. It's in the right place because Sheffield is a home to great manufacturing strength. It's been a centre of great learning at this university for a long time. I'm delighted to be in the constituency of Paul Blomfield, my good friend from Parliament. And I think that one of the huge challenges, to add to the list that was given earlier, that faces us, is how you get growth not just in the southeast of England, but balanced growth right across the country. And I think it's incredibly important that we have centres of learning and thinking around political economy which are outside London, outside the southeast. And so that's why I really welcome the setting up of SPERI. Let me also say, I was asking earlier whether I was in Nick Clegg's constituency. I gather I am not, but some students have the good fortune to live in halls of residence in his constituency. I will tell you about my low moment recently, which was at the Labour Party conference. I was going to do my conference speech actually on the Tuesday of conference, and a young man came up to me and said, "Would you sign the Sky News Top Trumps pack for politicians?" And this is where I became convinced that there was indeed a News International conspiracy against me, because I looked at my card and it had these various ratings on them, and one of them said fanciability. And I looked at and I suddenly said to the young man, who looked rather surprised, "Can you give me that pack, please?" And I looked at my fanciability rating, and it was 36. And I thought, well, I don't know what 36 means. So I said, "Look, give me the pack and let me look at the rest of the cards." The next card was my shadow chancellor, Ed Balls, and he was a 54. And I thought, well, he's a decent guy, Ed Balls, but I've never thought he was that fanciable. Anyway, the next card, hence the appropriateness of this story here, was Nick Clegg, and he was a 65, which I found really unbelievable. But the reason I knew, I hope you agree with me, but the reason I knew that this was a conspiracy by the people of Sky News is that the next card was Michael Gove. Now, there are lots of things you can say about Michael Gove, but fanciable is probably not one of them. But I only scored 1 point more than Michael Gove, and that convinced me it was a conspiracy by News International. Look, I want to start seriously tonight with a story. And it's a story about an interview I did on the Today programme with John Humphreys. It's not the interview where he seemed to call me ugly. That was a more recent interview, and actually a rather easier interview, relatively speaking, than the one I'm talking about. It was an interview I did just after I became leader, and I'd written an article about the squeezed middle, a term that I use. I think others had used it before, and he spent a lot of the interview asking me what I meant by the term the squeezed middle. And his basic criticism was, this sounds like a weakness of this term, that it could apply to the majority of the population. And so we had an argument in this interview about how I define the squeezed middle. It wasn't the best interview I've ever done, in truth. what's interesting is that a year later, much to my surprise, I woke up one morning to hear somebody from the Oxford English Dictionary on the radio saying that their term of the year, which was entering the Oxford English Dictionary, was the squeeze middle. It beat, just so in case you're interested, Bunga Bunga and the Arab Spring, which I thought was some achievement. Now, I think that there's a sort of significance in this term and the fact that it entered the Oxford English Dictionary and the fact that it's become used in common parlance. And I think it speaks to the condition of the country. I think it speaks to the project of this research institute, and I think it speaks to the mission of the Labour Party as well. And that's really what I want to talk about tonight. And my argument is this, which is that to command consent and to be sustained, the political economy of a country has to deliver for working people, for the working people of the country. Seems pretty basic point. And I want to make the case tonight that the failure to do that since the war has led to a series of transitions in the political economy of Britain. And I want to argue that since the financial crisis of 2007 and the events that happened, we actually need to find a new political economy for our country and a new way forward. And I want to talk tonight about what I think that means and what it entails. What's the history of this? The 1945 welfare state settlement, which I'll talk about in a minute, was built in response to the failures of the 1930s. The 1979 market settlement, Mrs. Thatcher's settlement, was a response to the failures of the 1970s. What you might call the 1997 settlement, the New Labour settlement, which I'll talk about, was a response to the failures of Mrs. Thatcher, in particular in relation to the public realm, public services, the NHS, education, and so on. And now my argument is, after the financial crisis, we face the challenge of building a new political economy, again, in response to the failures that we see. And the fundamental failure is, I believe, this, which is that the kind of capitalism that we have in Britain, which for a time looked like it was delivering for the majority, is not actually delivering for the majority. People used to say in the 1980s and indeed in the 1990s, well, look, this model is going to be sustained because although 30 or 40% of the population have it pretty bad, for 60 or 70%, it's pretty good. It's the best thing that's on offer. It's producing rising living standards. John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous American economist, talked about this. Will Hutton talked about this in Britain in the 1990s. I think that is a fundamental thing that has changed in the last decade. And that is what is going to produce, I believe, or can produce, the change that we need in the political economy of our country. But I'm going to argue tonight that the lesson from previous transitions is that simply because the material conditions are there and consent has broken down for the system, it doesn't mean that change is going to happen. And there are three conditions for change. First, as I say, the breakdown of consent, and I'll talk about what I mean by that. Second, the ideas which can form the basis of a new settlement. That's why SPERI is so important. And third, the political coalition to make it happen. That's where I hope the Labour Party comes in. Now, why is this project important for the Labour Party? It is, after all, what the Labour Party was founded to do. Labour's mission has always been to represent the interests, fulfil the aspirations, and embody the values of working people. When John Humphreys asked me what I meant by the squeeze middle, it's taken me a year to give this answer, but I think what I should have said is, look, the squeeze middle are working people right across this country. People bound together now by a set of values, the value of working hard, whether in the factory, a mine, shop floor, in an army barracks, whether it's on the railways, at a supermarket checkout, or a call centre. People who are working hard, playing by the rules, and trying to make ends meet. And people who are worried, frankly, about their prospects in this economy. And people, and I'm going to talk about this as well, people who say, look, I just want a fair shot in life. And I don't want to find myself undermined by the big private vested interests in our country. Now, I'm not sure John Humphreys would have let me say all of that because, as you know, he interrupts people quite a lot. But what I want to argue is that actually the reason this term, the squeezed middle, matters, and the reason it has caught on as it has, is actually the story of British politics since the war is the story of the changing hopes and aspirations of people and the ways in which political parties have been able to represent them. And actually, with the decline of conventional class politics and the normal terms that we use in relation to class, which have, and we can talk about this in discussion, somewhat lost their meaning for people, that's why I think this term has caught on, and that's why I think it actually has wide application. So that's a relatively long summary of the argument. Let me start by saying something about the 1945 settlement, which is, if you like, the first historical period that I want to just discuss, and some of this will be familiar to people in the audience. Why did the 1945 settlement happen? I'll say something about what that is in a sec. Essentially because of the catastrophic failure of the previous decade, the 1930s, to meet people's hopes and aspirations. There was a very resonant phrase that I think was used after 1945, which was never again. Never again the unemployment of the 1930s, people not getting health care free at the point of use, as they could after the foundation of the National Health Service. Never again spoke to the catastrophic failure of the 1930s decade and the sense of the evils of unemployment, poverty, ill health. But it wasn't just about the breakdown of consent. As I said earlier, it was also an intellectual revolution based on the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, the economic ideas of John Maynard Keynes, the social reform of William Beveridge, and the understanding of society of T.H. Marshall. And fundamentally also the third part of what is needed to make the change happen, because of the political demands of millions of men in particular and women returning from war, coming out of a wartime situation. Funnily enough, that included my dad, who was an emigre from Belgium and who joined the British Navy. The parting words of his commanding officer as he was discharged from the army after the end of the war were, "Goodbye, Miliband, remember, don't vote Labour." He didn't follow the advice, actually. He did, and so did millions of others. And look, it's easy to forget now because we take a lot of these things for granted, but in its time, the 1945 settlement was a revolution in the political economy of this country. A revolution, most of all, in an understanding of what was the responsibility of government. Because people thought in the 1930s, well, look, there might be unemployment, there might be incredibly high unemployment. People remember people have heard of the Jarrow marches and so on, but it's not a responsibility of government. There's nothing really government can do about it, or indeed, it's not really the place of government to take responsibility for this. Government, after 1945, took responsibility not just for full employment, but for the National Health Service, for building council houses, hundreds of thousands of council houses. And as I say, the crowning achievement was the National Health Service. So the model of political economy of that period was based on the state providing a basic platform of services and assuring full employment and low inflation. And indeed, the interesting thing about it is this became a consensus between the political parties. One of the remarkable things of the Conservative Party of that period was that by 1950, 1951, they had completely adapted to the new settlement. And that's why in 1950, Harold Macmillan won in the election was won by the Tories in 1951, and then Macmillan was able to take forward that agenda. And this was a consensus that lasted for more than 2 decades. So that's the first part of the story. Both parties knew how central the aspirations of working people were to victory in an election. Now, by the course of the late 1970s, this spirit of 1945 had run its course. The magical combination of full employment, stable prices, rising living standards, and social mobility was no longer available. In particular, for those who don't know, high inflation at that time, partly caused by the oil price shock in the 1970s, meant that people's living standards were falling back. What good were big wage rises when prices were going up by 15, 20, 30, 40%? So the system was unable to meet the aspirations of working people. And in particular, the Labour government of 1974 to 79 found it impossible to reconcile the competing interests of different groups in society, in particular the trade unions. And this convinced people, this led to Mrs. Thatcher's election in 1979, and convinced people that a break was needed. So just as the 1930s settlement fell into disrepute, so the 1945 settlement fell into disrepute as well. And similarly, it wasn't just that consent had broken down, but the new right actually, throughout the 1970s, were preparing the ideas that Mrs. Thatcher would then implement in the 1979 to 1990 period. People like Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, their ideas were central to the arguments of the right. And what was this new bargain compared to what the 1945 bargain was? It was essentially about government getting out of the way. The market would deliver prosperity and opportunity. And indeed, some of that did happen. After financial deregulation, it was easier for people to get credit, and I'll come back to what that meant in a minute. You could buy your own council house, the emblematic policy of the period, and you could even buy shares in newly privatized companies like British Airways, British Telecom, and British Gas. Just to say this to you, a colleague of mine who I was talking to this speech about said to me this evening as I was about to come here, he said, look, I remember so well my father buying his British Telecom shares, selling them on the first day, and saying, now I can afford a foreign holiday. And, you know, my party, the Labour Party, was very, very slow to wake up to this issue of aspiration and the way in which Mrs. Thatcher, in many ways that we didn't like, was meeting the question of aspirations, people's aspirations for themselves, for their family, for affluence. And as I said earlier, the biggest symbol of this was council house sales, which we took a long time to come to terms with. So that's the second part of the story, if you like. A different political economy for that time. Now, what happened in the early 1990s? Because this is where the story gets a bit more complex. Because my argument is that New Labour, and I'll say a bit more about this, didn't undo the economics completely of Mrs. Thatcher. But it did undo, most importantly, the social settlement of the 1979 to 1997 period. And again, this is about the aspirations of working people and their families. By the early 1990s, people were saying, well, look, all of these council house sales and these shares being sold and being able to go on foreign holidays and having a second car in the drive, as Tony Blair famously said, this is all very well, but actually, we don't just rely on private affluence. What about the public realm? Again, Galbraith coined this term, private affluence, public squalor. And that's what it felt like in the 1990s. People were asking profound questions. I went to school in the 1980s, and in a Victorian building which looked like a prison and sometimes felt like a prison, but people right across this country still outside toilets in schools, prefab buildings, and all of that. And people were saying, well, hang on a minute, this private affluence is all very well, but what is happening to the public realm, and why is the public realm crumbling? And similarly, the NHS was a service in crisis. I often think when we're debating, as I was on Wednesday with the Prime Minister, the issue of the National Health Service, it is so easy to forget that in 1997, the NHS was a byword for not just crisis, but a service which might have had the right principles for our grandparents, but couldn't possibly be following the right principles for our grandchildren, because it was never going to succeed as a service. And I think New Labour's great achievement was to rebuild that public realm and say, actually, we can run decent public services. And also, people were asking other questions. So women, huge rise in women going out to work during the 1980s and 1990s, and a huge issue then came onto the agenda about family-friendly employment and other things. Now, what were the ideas of that time? It was captured in something which I think Colin Hay has written about called The Third Way. which was really an attempt to say economic efficiency, so running a dynamic market economy, relatively free market economy, and having social justice. They're not in conflict, as people have argued for a long time, including people on the left. They actually go together. They self-reinforce each other. If we run a dynamic market economy, if we're relatively hands-off in relation to the economy, we can then use the proceeds of growth, the proceeds of economic growth, tax revenues, to rebuild public services, tackle poverty. And indeed, the Labour government, I think it's officially been said by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, was the most redistributive government in history, that 1997 Labour government. But, and this is the fourth part of the story, I think it's very clear now in retrospect that that settlement, that 1997 settlement, was incomplete. What did it crucially miss out? It missed out reform, sufficient reform of the way our economy worked. It accepted too much of the settlement of Mrs. Thatcher in 1979. Finance capitalism, relatively deregulated markets, and the view that prosperity, if there was a general rise in prosperity, it would pretty much benefit everybody, or at least the vast majority of the population. And that's, for me, why the settlement was incomplete, and that's why I think this is such an important moment for the study of political economy. And that's where I really want to now spend the rest of the lecture, because why is this settlement incomplete, and what is this squeeze middle about that I talked about right at the outset? What is the nature of the squeeze? I want to talk about the squeeze in three particular respects. The first is the obvious, the squeeze on living standards. For 30 or more years, the bargain had been clear, which was let the economy grow, relatively free market economy, and everyone, including the low-paid, would get richer. And it did actually work for a time, partly because there were gains in productivity, and partly because of changes like more women working. So household incomes were going up, not particularly because the individual earner was earning more, but you had two people in a household working, not just one. And there were other factors that supported the rise in people's incomes. The rise of credit, cheap credit for people, which has its own problems later on. Cheap imports from Asia, which made a massive difference to people's living standards. And indeed, tax credits, something that the Labour government brought in. So although people's wages, particularly the lowest paid, may not have been rising, they were being supplemented by tax credits, and so people's incomes were going up. But I think what became clear by 2007, and if you like, the crash revealed this, and I think we should have woken up to it earlier, was that these factors were not enough to sustain rising living standards for working people, for the famous squeeze middle. The basic promise of the 1979 era, that those in the middle would benefit as well as those at the top, began to unravel. Just to give you a figure on this, for the 5 years before the last recession, i.e. before 2007, so from 2002 onwards, the economy grew by 11%, but the wages of everyone earning less than average income stayed the same, didn't go up. And on current forecasts, the average worker will be earning the same in 3 years' time as they were 10 years ago. So that gives you a sense of the squeeze in living standards that is taking place and the resonance of the idea of the squeeze middle. Essentially, the rising tide has not lifted all boats. And the result is an unprecedented squeeze in incomes. That's the first part of the story of the squeeze. And what's making it worse, this squeeze, is not just that wages are stuck, but also that prices are rising significantly. And this is another part of my criticism of the settlement that we inherited, which is the huge vested interests in our economy, from the banks to the energy companies to the train companies, which have actually been left in place too much untouched, in my view. And so, in fact, this government is making it worse. Just to give you an example, fares are going to be going up on some train routes by 20% over the next 2 years. Energy bills seem to go higher and higher, not simply because of climate change. Nearly 1 in 5 households here in Sheffield are fuel poor, And actually, there are figures showing that if things carry on as they are, the average household in this country, so the average household, will be in fuel poverty. So for too many families, the only way they felt able to sustain their living standards was through rising personal debt. It's the first part of the squeeze on living standards, and indeed personal prosperity. The second aspect of the squeeze is that working people are shouldering more risk in our economy than ever before. If you think about the 1945 settlement, it guaranteed people stable jobs, decent and rising living standards, and a defined benefit pension, so an assured pension at the end of their life. Now, in different ways, all of that has come apart, at least for a significant section of the population. Jobs are much more insecure. Wages, as I've said, aren't rising. And the pension system is being eroded in both the private and indeed in the public sector. It's incredibly hard for people to save for themselves or their retirement because they're so squeezed, but the pension at the end of their life that they're being guaranteed by their employers and others is also being squeezed as well. And then so that's the second aspect of the squeeze, the risk and insecurity of the modern labour market for people and for the squeezed middle. And then the third big challenge, and this is an appropriate place to be talking about it, is an intergenerational challenge. Because I coined this phrase a year or so ago called the promise of Britain, the idea that the next generation would do better than the last. I think what we see, and I don't need to say this to the young people in the audience because you know it much more than I do, I think you see that under question as never before, or at least not for a long time in this country. Tuition fees, the difficulty of getting on the housing ladder, the environment, all of these issues I think are part of the fact that people, the squeezed middle, are thinking, well, are my kids going to do better than me? I don't think that can be guaranteed in any way in the economy we live in. And at the same time, this squeezed middle is facing a care crunch at the opposite end of the spectrum. Older people, their mums and dads, who are maybe going into old age care, maybe having to sell their homes. So, a decade ago, people were talking about peace and indeed prosperity, and were saying, look, we've had a decade of uninterrupted prosperity. Today, the squeezed middle, I think, knows the system is not working for them. And at the same time, there appear to be runaway rewards right at the top of society. And we've seen this most recently over bank bonuses, but I think it's a phenomenon that we've not only seen the middle squeezed, but we've seen the top 1% soar away from the rest. I think it's another part of why the consent for the system is breaking down. What does that mean about the last general election? I think the reality of the last general election, I take my own responsibility for this, is that no party really answered these challenges, the challenges of the squeezed middle. They're hard challenges, but no party really answered them. No party offered people sufficient hope. No party really recognized that the very settlement, Mrs. Thatcher's economic settlement of 1979, which had been designed to support the squeezed middle, had actually broken down and was failing to serve the very people it was supposed to be serving. Now, we lost that election, but in the end, no party won the election either. And I think that's partly because I don't think anybody felt that politicians were answering what they were saying. It came home to me in my own constituency on the doorstep as I was knocking on the door, and I met a lady who was a classroom assistant who said she was in work, her kids had left home, and she talked incredibly movingly about the massive squeeze that she faced in her living standards. And why did no party offer anything to help her? I think it's a wake-up call to us all. Now, why do I say that consent for the old system has broken down? Because you might say, well, look, this all sounds a bit grim. It sounds like a very difficult situation, but we knew that in any case. What is different about this time? I think partly what's different about this time can be summarized if you think about the Occupy protests. The Occupy protests that have taken place at St. Paul's, near Wall Street, and elsewhere. Normally when these protests happen, you have the protests and you have the rest of the population. It happened very famously in America in the 1960s that there was a massive gulf between the protesters about the Vietnam War and, if you like, middle America. I think what is interesting about these protests is that most people are not going to go and camp at St. Paul's, but what people are talking about the 1% and the 99% and so on, is actually something that lots and lots of people are talking about. And my goodness, you can even read about it in the pages of the Daily Mail, which talks a lot about these issues, about what's happening in the banks, about what's happening to people's living standards, about what's happening at the energy companies. I think that's a sign that actually consent for the system is breaking down. But look, and this is the final part of my talk, anger at the old system's flaws is, as I've said earlier, not enough to produce change. It needs the ideas and the political movement to transform discontent with the old settlement into a new settlement. Now, I hope and expect that SPERI will make its contribution to the new settlement, and it's also what we're trying to do as the opposition. Identifying the issue itself, because I think that's actually an incredibly important part of the battle, to actually understand the gravity of the challenge to this system. And I think that, I don't think my political opponents recognize it at all. So understanding the gravity of the challenge and also starting to point a way to solutions. We're having a big policy review talking about this, but let me today give some brief pointers to where I think some of the answers lie. We know the limits of the previous settlement. Getting government out of the way on its own doesn't work. We also know the economic climate for Labour after the next general election, if we win it, will be far tougher than it was. There will be less money to spend. And what we know also from the things that I don't think New Labour did is that it won't be good enough to simply rely on spending money to patch up the failures of the economy we inherit. Inequality didn't go down under Labour. Part of the reason was we didn't do enough to change the nature of our economy. So I think a more fundamental change is needed. From the ashes of the kind of irresponsible capitalism that we have post-crash, we need to build a new capitalism, a new, more responsible capitalism. What is this based on? What are the principles that this is based on? Most of all, long-term, productive wealth creation with a much fairer distribution of rewards. So what are the elements of that? Long-termism, not short-termism, and I'll say something about that. A fairer sharing of rewards, not growing inequality. An understanding, and many business leaders understand this, that successful firms are those that invest in their people rather than neglecting them and move to a high-wage, high-skill economy, not a low-wage, low-skill economy. And also an understanding that the environment is not an enemy of economic progress, but is essential for it. Let me say something a bit more about what this means in practice. First, Britain needs a new era of long-term wealth creation. How do we do this? I think most of all, it is about using the power of government in new ways to set new rules for the way our economy works. One of the things that we've got Richard Caborn here with us tonight that he has been working on at the Advanced Manufacturing Centre is the notion of what an active industrial policy is about. An active industrial policy that says we're in a global race for the jobs of the future. And government just getting out of the way and saying we can just rely on financial services is not an answer. Government has to play its proper role in creating those good jobs of the future. It also is about industry taking its responsibility for training. We said as a first step, no major government contract should be awarded unless companies offer apprenticeships. And it also says, look, you can't just rely on the private banking system to help the small businesses and indeed the large businesses of the future. That's why we are examining plans for a so-called British investment bank to give the much-needed capital that small business needs so it can invest and grow. And anybody here who runs a small business will know the fight they have to have in getting money out of the banks. It's also about saying we have to end the situation where we have rewards for failure at the top of society, harming both the company and the workforce. Now, we've suggested a number of changes to that, including taxing the bankers' bonuses, putting an employee on every remuneration committee. I think that's just the start of the change that we need. George Osborne, by the way, it's a bit of politics here, but George Osborne said recently that action to tackle big bonuses is anti-business. I say it is not anti-business, it is pro-business. Because one of the lessons of the financial crisis is it was a something-for-nothing culture in our boardrooms that led to the crisis. The wrong incentives for people in the banking system. And I think that when the government defends what is essentially an unreformed bonus culture, they confuse the interests of the economy as a whole with the interests of a few at the top. That is, if you like, the old thinking. That is the thinking which is part of the old settlement. What do we need banks to be doing? We need banks to be lending money to small business rather than paying out big bonuses. So some people have said to me, look, it's no business, I had this last night at an event I was at, it's no business of the public what bonuses banks pay. Now, I fundamentally disagree with that, because even banks which are not publicly owned implicitly still benefit from a taxpayer guarantee to the tune of billions of pounds. And that's why we need a change in the bonus culture right across our banking system and responsibility from top to bottom right across society. But this is an important point. Tackling excessive pay at the top is not the whole answer to responsible capitalism. It is about building that long-term wealth that we need for the future. Secondly, standing up for the squeezed middle also means challenging the powerful vested interests that I talked about earlier, which are squeezing working people with the money that they do have. It means standing up to the banks, the train operating companies, the electricity firms, all of those big vested interests in society, which frankly at the moment people feel powerless against. Now, this government, I'm afraid, is making the squeeze worse by taking away things like tax credits. I don't think tax credits are the whole answer, but I do think that actually if you're looking for ways to raise resources, doing it by cutting tax credits for the working poor is absolutely the wrong approach. Third, and this is a related point, standing up for the squeezed middle also means making sure there is a fair tax system and a fair benefit system. That means everybody, including those at the very top, paying the amount they should in taxation. Now, that's why I say cutting the 50p rate of income tax is the wrong priority. And it's why I've also spoken out about offshore tax havens and all of the corporate tax avoidance and other tax avoidance that takes place. And on welfare, and this is a very, very important point I want to make, I think we need a welfare state which frankly meets people's needs better than it does at the moment. If you take the issue of childcare, care for young kids, and elderly care, they are two huge failings of our welfare state at the moment. It's actually for the squeezed middle, for working people right across this country, they are two things that make their lives far, far more difficult. But to get to that more expansive welfare state, we also have to reform the way it works and get more people into work. And that's why I say responsibility must be part of that agenda for the welfare state. For those who can't work, you absolutely need the best support, but for those who can work, they should be doing so. So you need to change the way your economy works to build a much more of a sense of long-term wealth creation with a much fairer distribution of rewards. You need to tackle the vested interests, the private vested interests that are actually squeezing people's living standards and making their lives more difficult, and you need a progressive tax system. They're, if you like, just the initial elements of the new settlement that I think is required. Let me then lastly say this in conclusion. The historical experience shows that even when consent for the system breaks down, it doesn't mean that change follows or that change follows quickly. We went through a lost decade in the 1930s and then the Second World War before the big change happened. The unfolding crisis of the 1970s took 10 years to really play itself out, 10 years maybe more. Currently, we hear the creaking of the old settlement and in a way the crumbling of its foundations. Families seeing their wages squeezed, small businesses not getting the finance they need, young people looking for work, unable to find work, 1 million young people out of work. I think anybody looking at the way things are thinks you need big change. But I think there's a danger both of the change not happening, but also a sense of pessimism. A sense of pessimism that things seem so grim that nothing can get better. Now, I think the most important thing I want to leave you with tonight is to say, actually, the lesson of history is that change can happen, and positive change can happen. Nobody would have believed in the 1930s that the welfare state settlement would have been built. Nobody in the 1970s would have believed that Mrs. Thatcher would have been able to succeed in the way she did. And again, in 1997, with the change we did see to address the concerns of working people, we saw a rebuilding of the public realm that actually lots of people would never have believed was possible. So my appeal to you tonight is to say, actually, believe in the power of politics to change things, and believe, and this is particularly a message to the young people here tonight, believe you're at a time of massive flux and change, a time of massive possibility. But it relies on the ideas and it relies on the political movement to make that happen. That's why I'm so grateful for SPERI's establishment. I think it's an incredibly important innovation. And I hope that it will be the task of everybody in this room who cares about these issues to turn our energy and resourcefulness towards how we create this reformed, responsible capitalism. Above all, a new model of political economy which delivers prosperity and fairness for the working people of Britain once again. Thank you very much.